Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be reacting to
Why didn't Sweden join World War II?
World War in Europe, there were many neutral nations who, despite their government's intentions, were unable to stay so. While some like Finland were able to resist, others like Sweden managed to avoid fighting. Given Sweden's immense natural resources, notably iron, it's even more surprising that it was left alone when the powers around it were fighting for their continued existence. Not only that, but Sweden would have been a valuable ally to whichever side it joined, which raises the question, why didn't Sweden join World
I don't see Germans invading Sweden.
why.
Over water? Did they even have a navy? Who they fought over water? Nobody? All they did land.
Oh no. In on water, the Normandy.
No, Normandy, the Brits landed on Normandy. Not the Americans landed on Normandy. But Germans, I don't even think they had like a solid naval fleet. I don't think they would have done nothing.
On the beaches of
World
Normandy.
War II, and how did it manage to maintain its neutrality and deter aggressors?
Unless they try to air, maybe, but I don't know. I don't think Germans would have even taken Sweden.
So,
Nah.
when the war broke out, Sweden declared itself to be a non belligerent nation. This shouldn't be surprising since Sweden had been a neutral nation since after the Napoleonic Wars. This was mostly because it was forced to hand over Swedish Pomerania to Prussia and thus had nothing binding them to mainland continental politics. Thus, by 1939, Sweden had over a century of neutral foreign policy stances behind it. It was governed at this point by Per Albin Hansson, who was doing everything in his power to keep fascist or communist sympathisers away from power. His government was a coalition of four major parties, and their foreign policy goals at first were simply don't get involved in the war. Yet, as many of you will be aware, the war soon came to its neighbours. Finland fought the Winter War against the USSR, and in 1940 both Denmark and Norway were conquered by Germany. For the Finnish-Soviet War,
Wow.
Hold up, I'm muted.
I didn't know
Norway was conquered by Germany?
that. I didn't know that.
How?
Swedish were sympathetic to Finland, and there were even some who called for
So I guess they did have some sort of naval fleet to take on Norway?
I thought no way. No
Sweden
way.
to formally get involved. Hansson resisted, and so Sweden covertly gave money and weapons to the Finns, and roughly 12,000 Swedes crossed the border to help in non-combat roles. As for Denmark and Norway, Sweden wasn't willing to go to such lengths to help them resist Germany, and this was largely for economic reasons. Sweden exported masses of iron ore to Germany throughout the war, and given that everyone else had been conquered, there was no other customers. In case you're wondering, the reason why Germany kept buying the iron instead of simply conquering Sweden was that Hitler assumed that the Allies wouldn't bomb a neutral country. So the only reason that Sweden was able to stay neutral was that it made concessions to both
That was a good assumption he made. He right about that.
sides. For example, when Germany conquered Norway, the Swedish government allowed German troops to travel through the country. They also allowed German troops to
So they kind of were on the side of the Nazis a little bit.
transit the country to Finland in 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This actually led to what's called the Midsummer Crisis, where ministers panicked over what to do because they really didn't want to be seen aiding the Germans in their war with the USSR. In fact, Sweden's King Gustav V said that if the Germans weren't accommodated, then he personally would not be willing to bear the consequences. And so they allowed German troops to cross, and throughout the war over 2 million German soldiers did so. Of course, Sweden couldn't just give in to what the Germans wanted, since at that point they may as well have just been a member of the Axis. And as such, Sweden was sure to aid the Allies too. For example, it took thousands of Jewish refugees from Denmark and all over Europe, as well as giving refuge to socialists and political dissidents. And furthermore, Sweden also took to covertly training Norwegian troops in its territory. They were also active in conducting espionage against Germany and fed troop movements and industrial information to the British and the Americans. And in the end, Sweden's neutrality in the war carries a confusing legacy.
Interesting. So they were neutral. They were basically playing because neutral is completely staying out of it. They were neutral. They were playing both sides. That's interesting.
I think that is neutral. That's some fence riding.
No, neutral is like basically fuck off, leave me alone. I don't get me don't get me involved. That's neutral.
No, I feel like neutral is like, okay, you talking to me, da 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 da. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And then I go talk to the neighbor. Yeah, 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 yeah. That's neutral.
That's just fake.
That's neutral.
That's fake.
That's called neutral.
Avoiding occupation and bombing was the priority for the government, and they did achieve that. They did so by facilitating German troop movements and providing it with valuable resources with which it could power its war machine. That said, what real choice did Sweden have? Denmark and Norway were conquered for reasons of strategy, and the Germans would have happily done the same to Sweden. And Sweden was sure to balance this with aiding the Allies and giving refuge to Europe's persecuted. In the end, Sweden stayed neutral by doing just enough to avoid the ire of both sides. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you.
Interesting. I didn't honestly. I completely forgot. I guess I'm sure I learned that Norway was also conquered, but
I didn't know that.
I did not recall that either. That's interesting. I kind of thought the Germans didn't have the naval fleet. How the fuck they took Norway? Huh. know.
Guys, of course, let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Join the Discord. And as always, share as much kindness as possible. Bye.